On the afternoon of April 9th, 1865, after Robert E. Lee signed the terms of surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, someone in the Union Army fired a cannon. Then another. Then another. The sound rolled across the Virginia countryside as soldiers who had been fighting for 4 years finally understood that it was over, and they wanted the world to know. Ulysses Grant heard the guns and immediately ordered them stopped. He sent word through his staff. There would be no victory salute, no celebration, no public display of triumph over men who were now, in his words, their countrymen again. Some of his officers were stunned. They had earned this. They had bled for this. Grant understood that. He also understood something else, that the manner of the ending mattered as much as the ending itself, and that men who had just surrendered their army did not need to hear the Union Army celebrating over them while they figured out how to go home. That decision, made in a few seconds on a quiet April afternoon, tells you more about who Ulysses Grant actually was than most of what has been written about him since. He was not the blunt, unfeeling instrument of destruction that his critics constructed during the war, and that certain strands of Civil War mythology preserved afterward. He was not simply a man who won because he was willing to spend lives that other generals were not willing to spend. He was something more specific and more interesting than either of those portraits. A man with a precise, unsentimental understanding of what war required, paired with a humanity that expressed itself not in speeches or gestures, but in quiet decisions like stopping those guns. He was also, before any of that, a man who had failed at nearly everything he tried, and who the world had largely written off by the time the Civil War gave him a second chance. That part of the story matters too, because it shaped everything that came after. Hiram Ulysses Grant was born in Point Pleasant, Ohio, in April 1822, the son of a tanner named Jesse who had strong opinions about almost everything and made sure everyone around him knew it. Grant spent his childhood in a household where his father's ambition was loud and his own preferences were mostly ignored. Jesse arranged an appointment to West Point without asking his son, and Grant went because not going would have required a confrontation he didn't want. An administrative error at the academy recorded his name as Ulysses S. Grant, combining his mother's maiden name with his given name, and he kept it, partly because he didn't especially care about the name he'd been born with, and partly because the new initials, U.S., suited him in ways he probably didn't think about consciously at 18. West Point left little impression on Grant, and Grant left little impression on West Point. He graduated in 1843, ranked 21st in a class of 39, not at the bottom, but nowhere near the top, and unremarkable in almost every assessed category except horsemanship, in which he excelled in ways that other cadets found difficult to explain. He rode horses with an ease and intimacy that looked effortless, which usually means the opposite. He was commissioned as a brevet second lieutenant and assigned first to Missouri, where he met Julia Dent at her family's plantation outside St. Louis. That meeting would shape the rest of his life in ways that had nothing to do with the military. Julia became the fixed point he returned to mentally throughout the war years, the person he wrote to almost every day when they were separated, and by most accounts the emotional anchor without which the worst periods of his pre-war life might have sunk him entirely. He went to the Mexican War, where he served under Zachary Taylor and then Winfield Scott in the campaign from Veracruz to Mexico City, one of the most brilliantly executed offensive campaigns in American military history to that point. Grant watched both commanders closely, absorbing lessons about logistics, the use of terrain, and the timing of offensive action that he would not need to draw on for 15 years, but that he filed carefully. He also watched, with something between admiration and reservation, how Scott managed the politics of high command, the relationships with subordinates, the communication with political superiors, the maintenance of confidence in an army operating far from its supply base. These were not abstract lessons. They were the practical mechanics of moving armies, and Grant was paying attention. The years after Mexico were the ones that defined the Grant legend in its darker register. Stationed at remote posts in the Pacific Northwest, separated from his wife Julia and their children by a continent and a pre-telegraph communication system, Grant began drinking in ways that eventually cost him his commission. He resigned from the Army in 1854, under circumstances that were understood by everyone who knew them. He went back to Missouri, tried farming on land Julia's father had given them, failed, and spent the winter of 1857 cutting firewood and selling it on the streets of St. Louis to keep the family fed. Someone who had served as an army officer, fought in a war, and graduated from one of the country's most selective academies, was selling firewood on a street corner in his mid-30s because nothing else had worked. He tried real estate after the firewood. That failed. He eventually went to work in his father's leather goods shop in Galena, Illinois, where his younger brothers were effectively his supervisors. He was 38 years old and had given almost everyone who knew him reasonable grounds to conclude that his life was not going to amount to much. The war found him in that condition, and what he did with it is one of the more remarkable reversals in American history. When the Civil War began in April 1861, Grant wrote to the Adjutant General's office in Washington offering his services and received no reply. He wrote again. Still nothing. He eventually took a position organizing Illinois volunteers at the state level, and from that beginning built a record that moved him up through the command structure faster than almost anyone anticipated. The moment that turned him from a competent local commander into a national figure came in February 1862 at Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River in Tennessee. Fort Donelson was a Confederate stronghold, and taking it mattered strategically because the Cumberland River was a highway into the Confederate heartland. Grant moved on it with about 27,000 men, supported by Union gunboats. The battle lasted 4 days. On the fourth day, with Confederate forces mounting a breakout attempt, Grant rode back from a meeting with his naval commanders to find part of his line collapsing and his officers looking at each other for guidance. He looked at the cartridge boxes on the dead Confederate soldiers near the breakthrough point and noticed they were empty. He told the officers around him that the Confederates were out of ammunition, that they had put everything into the breakout, and that the way to respond to a desperate attack was not to fall back, but to attack everywhere simultaneously. That is what he did. The Confederate commander, Simon Believer Buckner, requested terms. Grant's response became famous within days and gave him a nickname that followed him for the rest of his life. He wrote that no terms except immediate and unconditional surrender could be accepted. Unconditional surrender, Grant. U.S. Grant. The initials lined up and the country took notice. He had taken 15,000 Confederate prisoners, the largest capture of enemy forces in American history, to that point, and he had done it by attacking when the tactical logic said to be cautious. 2 months later, at Shiloh, the country almost lost him. The battle on April 6, 1862, began at dawn with a massive Confederate surprise attack that drove the Union Army back toward the Tennessee River and came close to destroying it entirely. Grant had not adequately fortified his position. His men were caught off guard. By evening, his army had been driven to a narrow strip of ground near the river landing, with their backs to the water and their formations in serious disarray. One of his division commanders found him that night standing in the rain under a tree, his coat collar turned up against the weather, and suggested that they ought to withdraw across the river. Grant considered this for a moment. Then he said he would attack in the morning. He did. Fresh troops had arrived overnight. Don Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio crossing the river to reinforce the shattered Union line. On the morning of April 7th, Grant pushed forward with everything he had. The Confederates, who had exhausted their best strength in the previous day's attack and had lost their commanding general, Albert Sidney Johnston, to a leg wound that bled out before anyone caught it, gave way. The Union Army recovered the ground it had lost and the Confederates retreated to Corinth. Shiloh cost the Union Army nearly 13,000 casualties. It cost the Confederates roughly 10,000. The combined number was so large, and the picture of near catastrophic Union unpreparedness on the first day so damaging, that the Northern press came for Grant immediately. Newspapers demanded his removal. Some reported he had been drunk during the battle, a charge that was unsubstantiated and almost certainly false, but that drew on his pre-war reputation in ways that were impossible to fully counter. Abraham Lincoln was asked by members of his own party to relieve Grant of command. Lincoln's response has become one of the more quoted lines of the Civil War. He said he couldn't spare the man because he fought. That observation captured something real, the defining characteristic of the Union generals who preceded Grant in importance. McClellan in the East, Halleck in the West was a tendency to find reasons not to fight, or to fight and then pause, to consolidate, to resupply, to wait for conditions to improve. The Army of the Potomac under McClellan moved with the caution of a man who believed that his army was irreplaceable and that losing it would be a catastrophe worse than losing the war. That caution was not cowardice. It was a strategic disposition, and it had a logic to it. But it was also a way of fighting a war that Lincoln gradually and then urgently recognized was not going to win. Grant fought. When he found an opening, he moved through it. When there was no opening, he created pressure until one appeared. The Vicksburg campaign between late 1862 and July 1863 demonstrated this with a specificity and a scale that established him as the most capable operational commander in the Union Army. Vicksburg was the last major Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi River. Taking it would split the Confederacy along a north-south axis, cutting off the trans-Mississippi states of Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas from the Confederate heartland east of the river. Everyone on both sides understood what it meant. The problem was getting to it. The city sat on high bluffs on the eastern bank of the Mississippi, surrounded by swamps and bayous to the north that made conventional approach nearly impossible. Grant spent the winter of 1862 and early 1863 trying a series of approaches that all failed: canal projects, bayou expeditions, attempts to find a navigable water route that would let him land troops below the city. None of them worked. Northern newspapers reported the campaign as a fiasco. Pressure mounted on Lincoln to find a different commander for the Western Theater. What Grant did instead was one of the boldest operational decisions of the entire war. In late April 1863, he moved his army down the western bank of the Mississippi, ran his supply boats past the Vicksburg batteries at night to get them below the city, crossed the river on April 30th with no secure supply line behind him, and drove into the interior of Mississippi. For the next 17 days, his army lived largely off the land, moving faster than the Confederate forces opposing them could coordinate a response, fighting and winning 5 separate engagements, and ultimately turning back on Vicksburg from the east, the one direction the Confederate defenses had not been designed to face. He invested the city on May 18th and began a siege that lasted until July 4th, when the Confederate garrison, starved and exhausted and out of options, surrendered nearly 30,000 men. The fall of Vicksburg, combined with Lee's defeat at Gettysburg the day before, marked the turning point of the war in a way that most people understood even at the time. The Confederacy had lost both its invasion of the North and its last major river stronghold in the same 48-hour period. Lincoln, who had been watching Grant's Vicksburg campaign with the particular attention of a president who needed results, sent him a letter that was unusual for Lincoln in that it included an admission. He wrote that he had feared Grant's decision to abandon his supply line and strike inland was a mistake. He wrote that he had been wrong. Grant was given command of all Union armies in March 1864, with the rank of lieutenant general, a rank that had not been used since George Washington held it. He came east and attached himself to the Army of the Potomac, not to replace Meade, who remained in formal command, but to provide the strategic direction and the will to use it as a consistent instrument of offensive pressure. What he found in the Army of the Potomac was a force that had good soldiers and competent subordinate commanders, but that had been conditioned, through 3 years of fighting under generals who feared defeat more than they sought victory, to approach each engagement as something to be survived rather than won. He also found a strategic situation that he immediately understood in terms that had escaped his predecessors. The Union's problem was not that it lacked capable armies. It had multiple capable armies: the Army of the Potomac in Virginia, Sherman's forces in the Western Theater, Banks in Louisiana, Butler on the James River. The problem was that these armies had been operating independently, each pausing when it chose to pause, allowing the Confederacy to shift forces from quiet sectors to threatened ones. Grant's answer was simultaneous pressure across every front, with every army moving at the same time. If they all moved together, the Confederacy could not reinforce any one point without stripping another. Lee's army would be fixed in place in Virginia, while Sherman destroyed the Confederate infrastructure in Georgia. The strategy was straightforward to state and genuinely difficult to execute, and it was also correct. The Overland Campaign that began on May 4th, 1864, when Grant crossed the Rapidan River into the wilderness, was unlike anything the Eastern Theater had seen. Every Union commander who had driven into Lee's territory before Grant had, at some point, stopped. They had stopped because Lee's army hit back with a ferocity that disrupted their plans, or because their supply lines were stretched, or because the casualties were higher than anticipated, or because the generals needed time to think about what to do next. Grant did not stop. After 2 days of brutal fighting in the wilderness, in which the forest caught fire and burned wounded men alive in the underbrush, and Grant took something close to 17,000 casualties, he turned south rather than north. He kept moving. When his soldiers understood what was happening, that they were advancing toward Richmond, rather than retreating toward Washington, they cheered in the dark. The sound spread through the columns for a mile in every direction. Something was different. They had a general who didn't run after a bloody repulse, and they knew what that meant, even if they couldn't fully articulate it yet. It meant the war might actually end. What followed over the next 6 weeks was relentless and costly, and by the attrition mathematics that Grant had calculated before it began, necessary. Spotsylvania cost the Union Army tens of thousands of men and produced the 20-hour hand-to-hand combat at the Bloody Angle that remains one of the most savage single engagements in American military history. The North Anna River produced careful maneuvering that achieved little. Cold Harbor on June 3rd produced the worst tactical decision Grant made in the entire war, a frontal assault on Confederate earthworks that his own corps commanders believed could not succeed, in which roughly 7,000 Union men were killed or wounded in approximately 1 hour. Grant later wrote that it was the one engagement he wished he had never ordered. That admission, from a man who had been at Shiloh in the wilderness, reveals something about what Cold Harbor was. His critics, then and later, used the Overland Campaign's casualty figures to make the butcher case. The Army of the Potomac lost roughly 55,000 men in 6 weeks. Those numbers are real and they deserve honest accounting. What the butcher narrative omits is that Lee's army lost roughly 33,000 men in the same period, a proportion of total strength that the Confederacy could not replace. Grant's strategy was not to waste lives. It was to fight continuously, deny Lee's army any extended period of rest or recovery, and impose losses that the Confederate manpower base could not sustain. The Confederacy entered the Overland Campaign with a strategic reserve it had been carefully husbanding. By the time the army settled into the Petersburg siege in June 1864, that reserve was gone. Lee's army would never mount a significant offensive operation again. The siege at Petersburg lasted 9 months, from June 1864 to April 1865, and it is the part of Grant's generalship that receives the least attention relative to its strategic importance. Grant held Lee's army in the Petersburg-Richmond line, while Sherman moved through Georgia, took Atlanta, marched to the sea, and then drove north through the Carolinas. This was the strategy working exactly as designed. Lee could not leave Petersburg to stop Sherman without uncovering Richmond. Drawing reinforcements from the Carolinas was impossible because Sherman had closed that route. He could not get reinforcements from the Trans-Mississippi because Vicksburg had closed the river 2 years earlier. He was fixed, and he was slowly running out of everything: food, ammunition, men, horses, the ability to hold a line that kept getting longer as Grant extended it westward, forcing Lee to extend to or lose his supply lines. When Grant finally found the opening in late March 1865, the Confederate line at Petersburg collapsed within a week. Lee tried to move his army west and then south to link up with Johnston in the Carolinas. Grant cut him off at every turn, moving with a speed and coordination that left Lee's options narrowing by the hour. By April 8th, Confederate rations were gone entirely. By April 9th, Sheridan's cavalry and infantry had blocked the last road south. Lee called a council of war that night with his remaining generals. There was nothing left to discuss except what surrendering looked like and how to preserve the dignity of the men who had fought for 4 years. Lee rode to the McLean house at Appomattox Courthouse in his best uniform with a dress sword. Grant arrived in a private's coat with muddy boots and the residue of several days of hard riding on everything he wore. He apologized for his appearance and explained that his baggage hadn't caught up with him. The two men talked for several minutes about the Mexican War, where they had both served, before getting to the business of surrender terms. Grant's terms were generous to a degree that surprised some of his own staff. The Confederate officers kept their sidearms. The men who owned their own horses could take them home for the spring plowing, and no one would be arrested or tried for treason as long as they observed the terms of their parole. Lee said the terms were more than he had hoped for, and then someone fired a cannon, and Grant stopped it. The question of what kind of man Grant was gets complicated by the layers of mythology that accumulated over him in both directions. The unconditional surrender hero of one tradition, the butcher and the drunk of another. Both portraits flatten something more nuanced and more human. He was a man who understood, with unusual clarity and unusual emotional steadiness, what a modern industrial war required. He understood that it required continuous pressure and the willingness to accept costs that previous Union commanders had not been willing to accept, not because those commanders lacked courage, but because they had not fully grasped that the only way to end the war at acceptable cost was to impose costs on the Confederate Army faster than the Confederate Army could absorb them. That is a cold calculation. Grant made it clearly and without flinching, and it was correct. But he was also the man who stopped the cannon, who told his officers that the rebels were their countrymen again, who, at Appomattox, found a way to end the war that gave the defeated army enough dignity to go home without the humiliation that produces long-term resentment. Historians have argued about the downstream consequences of those generous terms for a century and a half. What is not arguable is the impulse behind them, a man who had spent 4 years as an instrument of the war's killing, and who, when the killing stopped it completely and without ceremony. No victory parade through the Confederate surrender. No public theater. Just stop the guns, let them go home, and get on with what comes next. The man who sold firewood on a St. Louis street corner in 1857 and couldn't get the War Department to return his letters in 1861 ended the Civil War standing in a Virginia farmhouse parlor with the best general the Confederacy ever produced, writing out terms of surrender in the same plain, direct prose he used for everything. No flourishes, no speeches. He had a gift for the essential, for finding the thing that mattered and going straight at it, without ceremony and without hesitation. That gift served him equally well whether he was deciding to attack at Fort Donelson when the Confederate cartridge boxes were running empty, or choosing to push south after the Wilderness when every instinct the Army of the Potomac had been trained into said to pull back north, or choosing to stop a victory salute on a quiet April afternoon, because the men who had just surrendered everything they had fought for had no need for artillery fire marking the moment of their defeat. He understood what each moment required. In 4 years of war, at a scale and cost neither side had fully bargained for, he was almost never wrong about it. Relentless is the word that appears most in contemporary accounts of Grant, and it fits. But it was not the relentlessness of someone who couldn't feel what the war cost. It was their relentlessness of a man who understood the cost precisely and concluded that the only way to make it worth bearing was to end the thing as quickly as possible, which meant pressing forward always, even when pressing forward hurt. He saved the Union by being exactly that kind of man at exactly the moment the Union needed one, and by knowing, without anyone telling him,